Hello everybody, Tyranno here, and welcome back to our series looking at Italian tanks that still need adding to War Thunder. This is part 2, so if you haven't seen the first part, I'd recommend you watch that as well, where we looked at the Fiat 3000, Semovente Char B1 Bis, and the Semovente Da 14940 self-propelled gun. The first tank we're going to look at today is the P40 heavy tank prototype armed with the 7518 howitzer, which was the first iteration of what would later become the P40 heavy tank. Work on designing the P40 first seriously began in August 1940, when Mussolini ordered 500 heavy tanks to be produced, though the idea of developing a heavy tank had been kicking around for a few years at this point. It should also be pointed out that while this was considered a heavy tank by the Italians, in most other nations the subsequent design would be considered more of a medium tank. The design requirements for the new tank were as follows. The new tank was to be armed with the Abiche Da 7518 Modello 34 howitzer mounted in the turret, 3 8mm machine guns, and 1 20mm autocannon, while the armour was to be 40mm thick for the front and 25mm thick for the sides and rear. The engine used was supposed to produce 420 horsepower, but as we'll see later on, this didn't necessarily pan out. Ansaldo and the Directorate of Motor Vehicles were then each asked to develop a prototype, with Ansaldo's being chosen for further development. It should also be noted that the tank was provisionally named the P75 at this point, mainly on account of the calibre of the gun, which was bigger than any other gun carried by Italian tanks at this point. It would later also be referred to as the P26 on account of its 26-ton weight, though by this point it didn't quite weigh that much, and officially the tank was named the P40. Now looking at the armament first, we have of course the Abiche Da 7518 Modello 34. This weapon is a bit of a mixed bag, with its best APC-BC round in game having a maximum penetration of 44mm at 500 metres. Not an awful amount of penetration, but not great either. However, it does have access to the EPS M42 heat shell, which gives a max penetration of 100mm. This shell can allow the tank to be a rather lethal weapon against almost any opponents it might face. And of course it is a better gun platform than the Semovente M41, which also houses this weapon. The main downside of course is that due to the weapon being a howitzer, it only has a muzzle velocity of 400 meters a second with the heat shell, which will make aiming and hitting targets with this shell much harder. However, the upgraded APC-BC shell has a velocity of 476 meters a second, so you'll have a much easier time hitting targets with that shell, albeit at the cost of armour penetration in the event of a hit. It should also be noted that the prototype pictured is said to have had a wooden mock-up of the 7518 howitzer, but considering it was designed to take the gun and the weights would have been known, I see no reason why that should be an impediment to implementing it into War Thunder. The secondary armament of the prototype P40 consisted of one 8mm Coraxel machine gun and two 8mm machine guns in the bow of the tank, the 20mm autocannon requirement seeming to have been dropped at this point. The armour on the prototype was 50mm for the front and 40mm for the sides, much more than called for in the original requirements and perhaps reflecting lessons learnt from the initial combat experience of Italian tanks. However, as you can see in the pictures, the armour is still riveted and the whole shape is rather flat at the front, rather than the sloped armour that would later be seen on the production P40. And of course this does negate some of the armour of this tank. However, even without the sloping, it would still have comparable armour to the M1542 medium tank, and while not ideal, it would still provide a decent amount of protection, at least against low calibre rounds. Though of course equivalent tanks would likely be able to penetrate the P40 prototype without too much difficulty. The prototype had a top speed of 40 km an hour or 24.8 miles per hour, and it was powered by a 330 horsepower V12 diesel engine, which would go on to cause quite a few production delays. As mentioned earlier, a more powerful 420 horsepower engine had been desired, but development of this engine didn't pan out, leading to numerous delays as the 330 horsepower diesel engine was developed instead. The tank itself also weighed in at about 24 tonnes, 2 tonnes less than the eventual production P40 heavy tank. Its mobility is broadly the same as the production P40, and it is decent if not spectacular, allowing the P40 prototype to be pretty mobile on the battlefield. able to flank enemies or respond to situations quickly, though its reverse speed is likely similar to the production P40 at only 5 km an hour or 3.1 miles per hour, which could be an issue when trying to reverse into cover or reverse away from danger. Lastly, the crew complement was 4, consisting of a driver and a machine gunner in the hull, and the commander and loader in the turret. Of course, due to only having 2 crew members in the turret, this would have increased the workload of the commander, who would have had the job of not only operating the gun, but also commanding the tank, communicating with other tanks, spotting targets, and many other jobs. Of course, in-game having one less crew member also makes the P40 easier to destroy via crew loss, as most other tanks at this time had 5 crew members, which in-game allows them to absorb crew losses more easily. The prototype would be presented in November 1941, with there still being disagreements on whether it would ultimately be armed with the 75-18 howitzer or the 75-32 gun, though in the end it was decided to use neither of these weapons and instead use the 75-34 gun, which was a more effective anti-tank weapon. The project would also be significantly delayed by engine issues, but also by the examination of a captured Soviet T-34. This prompted a rather large redesign of the hull, making it much more sloped to give better protection, and this would be incorporated into the production P40. However, due to various delays, the production of the P40 wouldn't start until just before the signing of the armistice of Koszybul, with the P40 subsequently being produced for German use. I have to wonder how the prototype P40 might have performed if put into service a little bit earlier in its prototype form. Of course it would perform worse than the production P40, but considering these never actually saw service with the Italian army before it was occupied, I feel like having more of the less effective variant in service would have been an improvement for the Italian tankers, and would have helped level the field against British tanks. Then again, it might have been introduced just in time to meet the American M4 Sherman, which would have quickly outclassed it. However, moving back to War Thunder, where would the P40 75-18 variant actually go in the Italian tech tree? While in theory it could be a premium or event tank, I feel like it could go at 3.0 in the regular tech tree, replacing or supplementing the Panzer IIIN, which currently resides between the M1542 and the P40, giving us an actual unique Italian tank over a German tank. I feel like gameplay wise the P40 75-18 would play pretty similarly to the Panzer IIIN, with its shells having almost identical penetration characteristics, while also having a very similar armour thickness, with both tanks having 50mm frontal armour, though the P40 75-18 would be slower at 40 km an hour versus the Panzer IIIN's 54 km an hour. Overall, I think the P40 75-18 would be a rather fun tank to have in the Italian tech tree, and would effectively plug the gap between the M1542 and the production P40 without having to use a German vehicle. And so hopefully Gaijin will see fit to add it to War Thunder at some point in the future. We now come to the Fiat 2000, a rather interesting Italian tank that was produced during World War I. If you're wondering why we're covering a World War I tank, basically in my last episode on Swedish tanks, which I'd also recommend you go and watch, I discussed the idea that World War I tanks could be added to War Thunder at a battle rating below 1.0. So for example, you would have 0.0 be the starting point for World War I tanks, preferably with a battle rating spread of 0.7, allowing World War I tanks to fight amongst themselves, while the very best ones could potentially still fight very early Tier 1 interwar and World War II tanks. Now of course, when people think of tanks from the World War I period, people tend to think of the German A7V, the British Mark IVs, or the French FT-17s. However, the Fiat 2000, while never seeing any combat during the war, does have the distinction of being the largest tank constructed during that conflict, weighing in at 40 tonnes. Of course, the much more famous French Char 2C, while weighing in at 69 tonnes, was not finished until after World War I had ended. The armament of the Fiat 2000 is pretty interesting, with its main armament in particular being somewhat difficult to balance within War Thunder. The main armament was the Cannone da 6517 Modello 13, which was a 65mm mountain gun, and this was placed within the turret. Now you would think that being a pre-World War I gun, it would have very limited armour piercing capabilities, and at least with regards to its AP shell this is true, with its penetration being somewhere around 30 to 40mm at 500 metres at a 0 degree angle. Also note, in the US documents I've used, it is referred to as an AP shell, but they also say that it contains explosive filler, which will of course add to the effectiveness of that weapon. However, the 65mm gun could also fire two heat-like shells, one being an EP or Effetto Pronto shell, and the other being an EPS shell, which stands for Effetto Pronto Speciale. Now technically the EP shell acts more like a HESH shell due to having its fuse at the base of the shell, as opposed to on the nose with the EPS shell, so this gun could potentially have a HESH and a heat shell. Unfortunately, these shells represent some difficulty in balancing, as according to the book Italian Artillery of World War II by Enrico Finazza and Ralph A. Riccio, the EP shell had a penetration of a whopping 120mm. Now in theory this does seem technically plausible, as the US 60mm M6A3 rocket can penetrate around 102mm of armour, and the Italian shell would likely weigh more and was 5mm larger in calibre. That said, I do wonder if the shell that achieved this was more likely to be the EPS heat shell, which seems much more likely to achieve such a high penetration. But I also have to wonder what armour it was tested against to achieve such a penetration. That said, even if it turns out the penetration figure is a little higher and that it was actually nearer to 100mm, it would still be a very effective gun. Then again, as this was a World War I era tank, it's likely it would only have access to the less effective AP/APHE shell. For the secondary armament, the Fiat 2000 had an absolutely ridiculous armament of 7 6.5mm machine guns, with the standard design seeming to be 2 machine guns at the bow, 1 on each flank, and then 3 machine guns at the rear of the tank, giving a very good 360-degree coverage against enemies. It should be noted that later on in its life, one of the Fiat 2000s was upgraded with 2 37mm guns in place of the bow machine guns, but today we're just going to focus on the original configuration. Moving on to the armour, at a maximum of 20mm, it would have been okay for the World War I period, but it would not be particularly effective against more modern weapons. And due to its large size, enemies targeting the Fiat 2000 will have plenty of places to shoot away at you and try and find a weak spot. Interestingly, vanadium plates for the armour were taken from the uncompleted Italian battleship Cristoforo Colombo, though I doubt that fact will make too much difference in game. Unfortunately, we now come to the speed, and this is where the Fiat 2000 really struggles. It's powered by a 250 horsepower petrol engine, which doesn't sound too bad, but remember this is a 40-ton tank, which means that the top speed is only 7.5 km an hour or 4.6 miles per hour, which is about half the speed of the Char 2C, and would make this pretty much the slowest tank in the game, which would mean you would really need to seriously consider where you want to go on the map upon spawning, as you probably won't get a chance to change your mind later. Lastly, the crew complement is 8, consisting of a driver in the hull, gunner in the turret, and the rest of the crew were there to man the machine guns. Technically the crew isn't enough to man all of the machine guns simultaneously, but this seems to have been a deliberate choice as not all the machine guns would need manning at the same time, so crew members could switch between them as needed. Ultimately, the Fiat 2000 was not that successful, with only 2 examples being built and not actually seeing combat in World War I, though at least one was sent to Libya during the Second Italo-Senussi War, also known as the Pacification of Libya, where I can only imagine its slow speed made it somewhat unpopular compared to the faster Fiat 3000. In the end, these 2 examples appear to have been scrapped not long after the start of World War II, which is a bit of a sad fate for Italy's first domestically designed tank, and a rather large and impressive machine. But where could the Fiat 2000 go in War Thunder? Personally, I think that despite the impressive performance of the 65mm guns HESH and heat shells, I think the Fiat 2000 shouldn't have access to these rounds, and should instead be placed at a very low battle rating, maybe around 0.3, 0.7 at a push, where it can fight primarily amongst World War I tanks. Here it would still have a very good armament, and its armour would provide very good protection, while maps could be specially designed for World War I tanks, which could negate some of the issues that might arise from the lack of speed, perhaps by making these maps smaller or putting spawns closer to the action. Overall, I would like to see the Fiat 2000 added, as it does represent the first domestically designed Italian tank, and while it would suffer against even low-tier World War II tanks, I think it would do rather well against other World War I tanks, and would be a fun tank to play and just a bit of a laugh, if only for its meme status, as a very rather large tank. We now come to the Semavente L3 Dirt 4732, an Italian tank destroyer based on the CV-35 Tankette, and one of Italy's first attempts at designing a tank destroyer. This involved the removal of the superstructure of the CV-35 and replacing it with a 47mm gun, offering a massive improvement to anti-tank capabilities compared to the original armament of just two 8mm machine guns. The weapon used on this vehicle was the Cannone Dirt 4732, and in-game this has a maximum penetration at 500 metres of 46mm with its APBC shell, which is a decent performance for the lower tiers. Unfortunately, it doesn't have any secondary armament, so you would have to rely exclusively on the main gun. Being based on a tankette, the armour is of course very light, with the CV-35 hull maxing out at 14mm thick, barely able to stop even heavy machine gun rounds. Then of course you have the gun itself, which appears to have started off with literally no protection, but later had a gun shield added. Though again this would provide limited protection and would leave the crew exposed to danger from all angles and weapons, and would especially be vulnerable to enemy aircraft. Therefore, being hidden and striking when it is least expected would be the aim of the game with the Semavente L3, as any stand-up fight will lead to your quick destruction. Mobility should remain broadly the same as the regular CV-35, with a top speed of around 42 km an hour or 26 miles per hour. Decent speed for getting around the battlefield, allowing you to reposition yourself as and when needed. Lastly, the crew complement was free, consisting of a driver in the hull and the commander and loader manning the gun. In real life, the Semavente's L3 didn't progress beyond the prototype stage, with the Semavente L40 Dirt 4732 instead chosen for production, which does make sense since it does have the same gun and is much better protected while also providing a similar speed. However, I could still see the Semavente L3 working in War Thunder, perhaps as a premium or event tank, though it could fit into the regular tech tree as well if required, perhaps between the L333cc and the Semavente L40. Or perhaps even folded with the L333cc, as they are very similar vehicles. Either way, I think the Semavente L3 would make a great starting point for players getting into Italian tank destroyers, as you would have access to a very good gun on a decently mobile chassis. And while of course it would suffer from a lack of armour, this would hopefully allow players to try and focus on ambush and hit and run tactics, areas where the lack of armour would be less keenly felt. So anyway, that's it for today's episode. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. I'd like to hear your opinions on these vehicles and other Italian vehicles you would like me to cover. I look forward to reading your comments below. So anyway, like I say, hope you enjoyed the episode. Hopefully you'll join me for the next one. I've been Tyranno, and I'll see you next time.